was in the winter of the year 1945. Europe was covered by a thick layer of snow. It looked also peaceful, but Second World War was still going on. A 15-year-old boy, Matthias was his name, received a recruitment letter from the German army. After 6 weeks of military training, we find Matthias and his troop standing at a small train station in the mountains near the city of Vienna, waiting for the train that would bring them to the battlefield. However, Matthias knew he cannot and he will never fight for the Nazi regime in this brutal war. So when he saw another train leaving, he did not hesitate. He ran after the train, he jumped onto the train and hid in the coal wagon. Next to the train, his officer was running with a loaded pistol in his hand, and Matthias knew if he is caught, then he will be punished to death. This is what happened to all of the people who were caught after resisting against the Nazi regime. Matthias is my grandfather, and living up by his values has always been important for my grandfather throughout his whole life. And I'm so proud of him. He's a big role model for me. He's the reason why I became activist, dedicating all my life into trying to find solutions to the biggest threat of our time, which is not the Nazi regime anymore, but climate change. I remember countless hours sitting with my grandfather at the kitchen table, discussing the past and discussing the present. And I told him about the devastating consequences that climate crisis already has and will have on humanity, like heat waves and droughts, like crop failure and famine, like hundreds of millions of people becoming climate refugees, political upheaval and parties of the extreme right, populist parties gaining power and more, and eventually conflicts and war. My grandfather listened carefully to what I said, and soon he began voting for a greener party. And when I organized climate strikes, he and my grandmother, they joined the protest. They were 90 years back then. Last November, my grandfather passed away. I was at the climate conference in Egypt back then, and I could only say goodbye to him on the phone. In this very last conversation, I told him that I was incredibly thankful for him showing me how I can have an impact on this world. And now I'm standing here with a clear message to all of you. We need you people. Please get involved. Why? First, because the climate crisis will affect all of us. It will affect you, your families, your freedom, your political and physical security. Secondly, because all the solutions and technologies we need to tackle the climate crisis are already available today. The only thing we are lacking is the right political policies and regulations. Thirdly, politicians tend to still work against the solutions than to promoting the solutions. Why? Because it's always easier to pretend to make fake climate action than to do real climate action. And this is the place where we people need to step in. We, in most countries, can make possible what is needed. The only thing is that only for us individuals, it's always easier to find excuses than to become active. For example, when I asked a friend, David, whether he wants to join a global climate strike, he said no. And yet I know every evening he's spending hours in watching Netflix. Natasha, she's an actress with 200K followers on Instagram. When she was asked whether she wants to sign an open letter against a new oil pipeline, she said no, fearing that it is not compatible with her sponsorship contracts. And Christine, who is the CEO of a steel company, even though she wants to shift to renewable energies, is not willing to publicly criticize the local government that is preventing a new wind farm from being built. All those three people have in common that they could become active, but they do not do so out of convenience. Looking in the audience, I think that most of us living a life that is way better than the global average. We live in stable democracies, we have freedom, we have good education, and we have often a good job. But are we willing to use those privileges to make impact to the world? Are we willing to put the common future above our own career goals? Are we willing to become activists on the street, activists in our companies? If you're still uncertain, let's remember my grandfather. For him, standing up against this brutal Nazi regime was not a question of convenience, it was a question of life and death. And for us, compared to that, it's so much easier to become active. And becoming activist gives you so much power and so much joy. So let's do it. Let's jump on that train like my grandfather did before it leaves the station.